like to take your seats, and they'll get going. So we have 3 presenters in our next session. And I was part of all that email exchange that we've heard about and how we blend this conference electronically. And as we were thinking about the program today and sort of recruiting people who could come and speak to us, it was actually really neat the way the program fell into 3 pieces. So the session that we've just heard, as you're really aware, is about context and sort of to set the stage for the War of 1812. And then in this middle section, we're wanting to focus on women's roles and experiences during the War of 1812. And if you peek ahead, you'll see that later, in the afternoon session, we'll be thinking more about remembering and commemorating. But it's really interesting for me to sit in the audience this morning and realize that in each of the sessions, I think all 3 of these things are happening, where we're thinking and learning more about the context of the War of 1812. We're hearing about particular women's experiences, from individual women that Jane Arrington was featuring there to Aunt Dinah that we saw on the screen. And we'll be hearing more about individual women as the day unfolds. And then what I really appreciated as part of Rick's presentation there was the images that show us the commemoration aspect. So it's really interesting to us as program planners how this is all weaving together so nicely. So I thought I'd, just bring that commentary. And you'll be looking for these 3 threads as we go throughout the day. So we have 3 more wonderful presenters in this session, and I'm going to follow Gail's model in introducing them one at a time and have them speak, and then I'll introduce the next one. So our first presenter in this panel is Dr. Julia Roberts, who is an associate professor of history at the University of Waterloo. Speaking to her last night, she told me that for the first time she had the luxury of a teaching term where she was teaching only graduate students. So I can only imagine what a wonderful experience that must be. But Julia is the author of a book called In Mixed Company, and it's the history of taverns in the early 19th century. So as I was driving here this morning with my ride, I jumped in and carpooled with someone, and we came down Yonge Street through Hobbs Hollow and passed by a tavern. I thought, Julia! This is Julia's stomping ground. Not just here, but throughout Upper Canada. Today's, not because it's, no, don't get So Julia, we're looking forward to your talk today. Julia's entitled to her talk, Repositioning the War of 1812.
Thank you. I'm engaged in a large study of the War of 1812. So what I thought I'd do today is explain the premise and the context of that study, and then move on to a particular document that I'm actually, to be truthful, struggling with at the moment. So sort of big picture and then zero in on something very, very small. So the premise of my project is that during the war, almost any society articulates its terms of social inclusion and its meanings and the meanings it attaches to cultural and social membership with really pronounced clarity. This is, I would argue, particularly so for colonial societies, because colonial societies, particularly like the Canadas, are complicated by issues of indigeneity and complicated by issues of heterogeneity. Current historiography, and I'm going to generalize a lot about current historiography in this talk, even though I know there are some isolated exceptions. But current historiography of the War of 1812 interprets it as the pivotal event that launched a unified quote-unquote Canadian identity, an analysis that is made absolutely explicit in the permanent War of 1812 exhibit at the Canadian War Museum, which I know is undergoing transition right now as they develop a special exhibit for 1812. My understanding of the colonial Canada is slightly different than that. It stresses instead a much more fluid sense of identity. It stresses instead a much more complexly negotiated sense of identity and indeed of public identity. And I think believe that the war indeed compelled the colonies, very, very different peoples, to express how they each belonged or did not belong, or belonged in unequal ways or not always predictable ways to this colonial society of war and what followed it. So I just want to read you some voices from 1812. The Anishinaabe tell of, for example, spying on an American fort. Quote, "So 5 Anishinaabe warriors were asked to investigate, and those men became bats, and they flew off. All gave the same report, that's how many tents there are, and that's how many guns there are up front." A government administrator reported how, quote, "the Western Indians joined us at the head of the lake, nearly 4,000 men, women, and children. A U.S. officer saw among the British Allied casualties, quote, but one of their Indians and one Negro with the Glengarry uniform dead on the field." A militia captain wrote after battle of the, quote, "women collected in groups in every public place. Women spoke of the toll of war upon their household economies. Sarah Clark claimed recompense for, quote, a quantity of kitchen furniture taken away by the United States Army. Elizabeth Stull claimed 2 pounds for a, quote, large crock of butter. And Margaret Wilson reported, quote, 2 cows killed and taken." And so on. These voices go on and on and on. I have examples about child soldiers, officers in tears, problems with regulation around the war, and so on. And these then are very diverse words. They're from warriors. They're from housewives. They're from soldiers. They're from officials. And together, they raise issues of, for instance, racialized identity. Both in an indigenous language that emphasizes powerful ability, the ability to become bats and do surveillance, right? But also, and I don't think I read an example of this, also in a colonialist language of race that presumes a white prerogative to judge and to hierarchize, place racial identities in hierarchy. They speak of gender and position women and actually also First Nations families, which we often don't glimpse, right? We get to see First Nations warriors, particularly, I think Susan's gone, particularly a few great chiefs, but here we've got 4,000 men, women, and children at the head of the lake. And they position women and families within the public in the context of a social structure that granted white men and white boys unquestioned precedence, albeit frequently subverted, but unquestioned precedence in this society. They speak of boys as soldiers, raise questions about the parameters of the masculine, and so on, in examples I didn't read. So me, or us, today, asking questions then about some of the concerns that still trouble us, such as issues of cultural membership, issues of social belonging. These mesh very, very well with the preoccupations articulated by the combatants and non-combatants of the War of 1812 in the Canadas. To generalize about the historiography, essentially it hasn't been much interested in these matters. Generally, War of 1812 political and diplomatic historiography tends to argue that Canadians first articulated a sense of common identity in the aftermath of the conflict. That is, that the war brought people together and first encouraged them to think of themselves collectively as a constituent member of British North America, or the British Empire in North America. And again, and for example, the Canadian War Museum announces its upcoming innovative, I have a remote, innovative exhibition. This is their webpage announcing it. The exhibition is not available yet. In what I would argue is decidedly non-innovative language. Learn the history behind the conflict that helped shape Canada into the nation that it is today. It's still that teleological history of nationhood that late 19th century Canadians first wrote about, as we know from the work of Cecilia Morgan. Oh, and the issue, the image that accompanies this is, oh, sorry, I haven't lectured this semester. I'm going to leave this out. The image that accompanies this is still that red jacket of Isaac Klotz with the bullet hole right through, right? This is the innovative approach. Anyway, speaking of which, military historians generally work to explore the nature of the war in a colonial context. As a group, these historians have tended not to see their soldiers as gendered beings. Until the work of Alan Taylor, they didn't even really see them as politicized beings. And I guess the most important and emerging exception to this generalization is in the field of First Nations historiography, the best of which places the War of 1812 within a chronology of First Nations history, as opposed to, for instance, seeing them as British allies or somewhere on the periphery, or as British Indians, as a very recent book does, albeit one written outside the Academy. Generally, social historians have simply ignored the War of 1812. Unless one considers studies of political thought as part of social history, for instance, as Jane Arrington talks and writes about. But, and generally, because social historians are interested in the long, enduring patterns of the past, demography, families, economic transitions, intellectual transitions, popular culture and social norms, and the effects of each of these upon individual and group identities and experience, they have tended to avoid distinctly dated experiences, like the War of 1812. The result of this is that we simply do not have a social history of the War of 1812, even though, yes, I know George Shepard wrote a book that has that as its title. Understanding the War of 1812 and women and the War of 1812, as we're working on today, goes a long way, I think, to providing that social history. Yet the War of 1812 for women is so funny in its way to attempt to research, and I mean funny in the bad way. The topic puts us smack in that place that we tell our students about. That place that existed in so many times and so many other places that failed to value and failed to conserve women's stories. As we know, this has to do with the privileging of male experience and male perspective, particularly so, I think, because of the assumed masculinity of war. So encountering, and I think, and I'm almost positive, and there's a couple of people in this room who tell me if I'm right or wrong on this, an almost unknown document. Certainly a massively underutilized one within the context of dearth was exciting. And it is this one, which I realize is completely illegible for you. Believe me, the originals are almost completely illegible for me. And I'm used to working with early 19th century handwriting, and this one is just tough. It's called, quote, A Lady's Campaigns in Canada during the years 1812, 1813, and 1814. Well, I can't really say. Okay. It's part of the William Dunlop collection held at the National Library of Scotland, and of course we have microfilm copies at the National Archives in Ottawa. As you may be able to sort of see on the left, they use a broken ruler when they're microfilming documents at the National Library of Scotland, and this lets us see that this is a really large folio set of sheets. And 26 of them survive. It is, after all, called extracts, and these were purportedly sent to Tiger Dunlop or to somebody from the It's a very bizarre collection. And tell the story of a lady's experiences. They tell actually a fascinating story. about a small, young military family's rain-swept journey into Kingston, Upper Canada. A night spent romantically under canvas, bivouacked with the soldiers. A valorous officer husband volunteering for dangerous duty on board a small boat in the midst of a storm, heading off across Lake Ontario. It tells of the attempt by the author herself to smuggle herself and her baby, Lily, on board this ship of war. It tells of her getting busted for it and getting kicked off the boat. It tells of her being stranded, quayside, rescued by a quote-unquote common soldier with a thick Irish brogue, landing under his guidance in an elegant cottage filled with similarly war-displaced ladies, convincing stories of anxious waiting and worrying, several stereotypical stories about Indian atrocities told by the ladies, some convincing passages about the pain of waiting and wondering after a devoted and beloved husband. And then in some different sounding voices, we get some battle stories, some versions of military heroism, and finally, a hair-raising account about crossing the harbor into York with a wounded but healing husband, little baby Lily, across the mushy, melting harbor ice, pushing a little tiny boat and trying not to sink through the ice as it flips.